Good Sunday evening to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to the Hurricane Hub discussion for Sunday, June 4th, 2023. All is quiet now, and especially as you can tell by the title card, as Arlene dissipates. Yes, we did have Arlene Friday and Saturday. Of course, after I did my live stream on Thursday, of course, if you remember that. Didn't really get a chance to post a video because I was busy, but Arlene wasn't that much of a significance anyways. It was weak, although it did have a decent run, but now it is gone, as you could see by the tropical weather bulletin, as we're not expecting anything to develop within the next 48 hours, and of course, the next 7 days in the Atlantic, and the same remains for the Eastern Pacific as well. Taking a look at the satellite in the Atlantic, you could see that is definitely going to be the case. So you could see also right here, if you can see these convective cloudbursts, that is associated with the remnants of Arlene, as it kind of speeds off to the northeast, associated with this big sort of frontal X system. That's obviously because of shear and environmental conditions. It probably will not regenerate. So there's no really need to worry about that. But other than that, you could also see across the general Atlantic too, we have the same pattern. ITCZ, you could see here right around the equator. Not much in terms of strong convective activity really blowing up, especially in the eastern Atlantic. Although there are some strong tropical waves that do move on from time to time. That'll be very interesting, honestly, throughout the season to see how these strong tropical waves behave, especially as we get later on when things start becoming more favorable. But obviously right now you could especially see, because of these low-level clouds here, dry air having an influence on the MDR, and of course that is typical of this time of year, so no need to really worry for right now, for development at least. It's going to take a few months, of course, when we start watching this area of the world to actually see development. For right now, and I'll show you a climatology map by the NHC. You've seen it before, but I'll show you it, of course, for updated for the time period that we're in now. I'll show you in just a little bit. But first, let's take a look at the sea surface temperature anomalies updated as of yesterday. Updates every day from the North Coral Reef Watch, and the same picture holds. The Atlantic is very, very warm, and I actually have some statistical details to show you just how warm the Atlantic is. It really is insane. And now the Caribbean too. You remember the Caribbean before was not that warm. Now it's really warmed up over the last week or so, or more like 2 weeks. And now just look at that. We've seen all this warm red and orange that we've seen out here in the eastern Atlantic kind of make its way into the Caribbean, and also beginning to notice that we're starting to see a return of these reds, and these dark oranges, I should say, begin to return in the Canary Current too. So the pattern there for the Atlantic remains favorable, and honestly, in my opinion, probably one of the most favorable patterns we've seen in the Atlantic so far over the last few years, if not the most favorable, honestly. And it's just really interesting, especially because of this developing El Nino, and off the coast of South America too. It's also warm, but definitely, if you remember, compared to March or April, when this area was literally, quite literally, scorching, with anomalies all the way up on top of the scale at 5 degrees Celsius, even anywhere from 5 to 7 degrees Celsius above normal. It was crazy. That has definitely cooled down now. But also something that is still very interesting that we need to kind of keep in the back of our minds: this colder look off the Baja Peninsula and the west coast of the United States, associated with the colder northern Pacific look, which doesn't necessarily kind of go exactly with an El Nino pattern, and that's starting to get the attention of a lot of people, at least from what I've seen. Compare this to the very warm Atlantic. It'll definitely be a very interesting thing to watch. But speaking of the warm Atlantic, the World Climate Service did tweet this, that because somebody asked him or her, I don't know exactly who it is, but World Climate Service in general, you get what I mean. Somebody asked the World Climate Service, what is the AMO index for the Atlantic as of May? And this is what the World Climate Service tweeted. It's up to 0.56 degrees, I believe, or 0.56 points for May. And very interestingly, this is the highest since August 2010, and it is tied for 1945 for a monthly record, at least from the SST version 5 data. This is the data we're looking at here is the normal coral reef watch data, but I mean they generally show very similar thing. It's just slight differences between the methods to calculate sea surface temperature anomalies. It's a whole kind of different concept that we could go over for hours, honestly. But of course that's a video for another time. But bottom line, the Atlantic is very warm, and very interestingly that it's the highest since 2010. And keep in mind that year was a record warm positive AMO, or record warm Atlantic, to kind of keep it in more layman's terms. So that is very interesting. And Michael Fisher too is also talking about it. He mentions as well, it remains to be seen how strong ENSO gets or how warm the North Atlantic stays, but the nearest analogs we have to this year using May sea surface temperatures were associated with above average hurricane seasons. And then he puts us where we are right now with our mean sea surface temperatures for May, not the anomalies, but for the mean sea surface temperatures. This is where we are right now, and we're basically warmer than the entire graph. This is the sea surface temperature mean for May, and this is all the other anomalies. And take a look at some of these red dots in here. I would assume this is probably, some of these red dots are probably, one of them at least has to be 2005 or so, and the others are probably other seasons that are within this range, because all these dots are kind of representing the ACE, and you can see all these oranges represent a season. I would believe all these orange dots above 200 ACE, and we are well above any of these dots. So I would just have to assume that whatever happens is very interesting, because we are paling above, and it just goes to show how warm the Atlantic is. And another way we could look at it, not just from people telling us, but actually seeing it for ourselves, this is the Normal Coral Reef Watch Sea Surface Temperature Anomaly Plot from Cyclonic Weather, a really good website. And you could also look at this on Tropical Tidbits too, which we used to. Now I'm going to kind of use Cyclonic Weather because I find it to be a little more, to kind of have a little more variety over different plots of different areas. And this is for the Eastern Atlantic. And here we are, 0.9 degrees Celsius above normal. And if you compare that to where we were in late April, early May, when the Atlantic was really scorching then, I mean, it's been scorching since the beginning of the year, especially compared to it now. Look at this this is mid-March, and now we're here in early June, and we've only gone up. So it just shows the Atlantic has been warm for a very long time. And it's not cooling down anytime soon. I'm going to show you another tweet with some more people saying the same thing. This is Torrin Hines saying that that I might sound like a broken record. I get it. I would understand too, because this is something that's been honestly with us for a while. But he's saying, here I am talking about it again, about weak trades over the Atlantic that don't want to get strong anytime soon. And the warm MDR, that's only getting warmer despite El Nino. And then he shows maps here. I'm kind of waiting for this to load a little bit. This is the Atlantic MDR. This is encompassing the entire MDR. The map that we use here, that's the Eastern Atlantic, but you generally get the idea that's been warming up. And then he shows the trades. And then he shows the trade graph here for the GEFS, the 850 millibar zonal winds. And this is the MDR right here, and you can see all these reds representing weaker trades, which is what he's talking about, trades not getting stronger anytime soon. And you can see, and if you remember, sometimes when we look at these graphs, the blue represents stronger trades, and the reds and the yellows and the oranges represent weaker trades and westerly winds, anomalous westerly winds. And take a look at that in the Atlantic, very strong, especially over here. Look at these dark reds, almost brown, in the Atlantic, representing really strong anomalous westerly winds. And this lasts basically for the next 10 days. The next week or so at least, we're going to have anomalous westerly winds in the Atlantic, and you could just imagine how much warmer this graph will, or how much higher this graph will skyrocket to. And who knows, maybe we'll end up breaching the record for the warmest Atlantic this year. I personally wouldn't be surprised, but whatever is happening this year is very interesting, and definitely we need to watch very closely. Though the Nino 3.4, as we did mention, despite El Nino, the Atlantic is warming, and despite the Atlantic warming, of course, there's still El Nino, and that is definitely present on the Nino 3.4. 0.8 degrees Celsius is the current value, and it's obviously going to get warmer as we go further in time, closer towards the latter half of the year, when El Nino will likely continue to strengthen. So we definitely are probably going to see an El Nino occur this year. I mean, it's practically already occurring, and you could especially know that that is happening if you take a look at the SOI, the latest 30-day value at 18 points, negative 18 points, and the current 90-day average is negative 7 points. And if you remember the rule of thumb that we always talk about when it comes to the SOI, we tend to look at 7 points on either side, either the positive or the negative range, to show which type of ENSO event the atmosphere is predominantly responding to, because that's what the SOI is. It's basically kind of more or less a value oscillation sort of pattern that we can look at to determine the atmosphere's response to ENSO, more or less. And we talk about negative 7 being the rule of thumb for El Nino and correlation to the SOI, and we're now there with the 90-day average. So, and you can take a look at it from the last month or so. It's just been going straight down. So the SOI is definitely not gonna the SOI is definitely responding. The atmosphere response for this El Nino is definitely there, but of course, especially with the warm Atlantic that we have this year, it's always interesting and very, very much of a thing that we need to watch very closely for, I would say, basically one choke up, because if we do have one choke up, it'll be very I would assume, especially in a type of year like this, we'll have to see if that kind of changes everything. And I say that because Eric Webb did tweet, I think this was today, yes, this was today, a warm Atlantic and a negative PMM. That's what, of course, we're talking about with the sort of Pacific situation, especially off the coast of the west coast of the United States. That's what he means by the PMM, roughly this area, kind of associated or kind of intertwined basically with the PDO that we talk about, the general Pacific pattern. Basically what it means to, what refers to negative PDO, is this right here, this colder look off the west coast of the United States and the Baja Peninsula. He mentions that will help with pump the brakes on the Berger, I'm not sure how to say this, but the Bergerkness feedback, kind of a ocean current feedback, I believe, that has to do with a warm Atlantic and of course El Nino. And he says that the brakes will be pumped on that this summer in the Central Pacific, and he mentions that as one reason why upward motion has been displaced west, as WXTCA mentioned. Though I expect that this will be temporary, he does mention even the Nino happy, because there is some sort of bias or perceived bias that the CFS and the GFS tend to be more or less on the favorable side for Pacific MJO, and a pattern that would generally more or less favor more El Nino like conditions globally. They are even going with an underwhelming signature for the El Nino. And you can take a look at that here. This is the GFS zonal wind anomalies, and once again you see a bunch of these blues over the tropical Pacific, and we always talk about how these blues represent stronger trades, and those are not favorable for warming of the waters, especially in the Pacific, for a developing El Nino. This type of pattern is not the pattern that we look for when it comes to the development of an El Nino. So this will be very interesting to see. Maybe this pumps the brakes on development of El Nino, maybe not, but whatever does happen, it'll be interesting. And especially with this warm Atlantic, I'll tell you, one screw up, I really do believe one screw up with this whole El Nino situation, that'll definitely have huge implications on the entire game as a whole. But really quickly moving away from that, the 850 millibar vorticity in the Atlantic, you could see vorticity scattered all across the subtropics still. And I always mention, watch as we continue to go towards the next few weeks, and we see a lot less of this jet stream activity kind of shift away from the mid-latitudes, and we start to see a lot more activity down here in the deep tropics as we start to see more of a transition towards hurricane season. Of course, it is early June, so we're still going to see a bunch of this, and right here off the coast of Florida, you could especially see, I believe this portion, I think, is the remnants of Arlene, and it still has decent vorticity, but of course, becoming attached to this overall general non-tropical system that seems to be off the East Coast right now. So obviously this doesn't really have any more tropical characteristics with it, so therefore not really watching this to develop or regenerate or be some sort of trackable entity. So no worries about Arlene for the moment, and of course for the rest of the Atlantic, nothing really much going on, but of course expected to change over the next few weeks. But I do want to mention before, which I find very interesting though, of course there still is some of it, but you notice here the Saharan air across the deep tropics of the Atlantic. And yes, I did mention, I was going to say honestly that I still feel like there generally would be more Saharan air than what we're seeing this year, because honestly this is definitely not the worst amount of Saharan air in the MDR that we could really get. Though of course, given that it's June, we're still expecting it, and we're still going to expect Saharan air outbreaks. Of course, dust that moves off the African continent from the Sahara Desert and into the tropical Atlantic. That is especially a hallmark that we see from June and July, which is most of the times we don't see much development out that way anyways. But we still, but of course, sometimes in years we can have less of that, and that's honestly what I think the direction is this year. A lot less Saharan air than what we typically would see, though definitely a stronger bit of Saharan air moving off Africa right now. And of course, for the meanwhile, that kind of will suppress any sort of tropical waves that get going or come off the coast of Africa. Of course, because of course, it's all dry air, and of course, air that is not really favorable for tropical development. And as I did mention, it's not really something that we watch out this way anyway, because it's not really a favorable area. It's usually more in the western part of the basin, closer to us, where we tend to see development. And I did see some signals in the long range, maybe, and some people are talking about this, maybe closer towards the middle to latter part of the month we'll get something that tries to develop, or some sort of general pattern that tries to develop that could be more favorable for something in the western Atlantic. And you can see this is at least for June to the early June, the first 10 days of June, from June 1st to June 10th, the climatology is generally in favorable of development in the western Atlantic. So anything that does try to get going here will definitely have a better chance, because climatology is in more favor of stuff developing closer to us in the western Atlantic, and of course not out here. And then in the eastern Pacific, we have off the coast of Mexico, which is also another favorite area for development, but not really looking at anything out there, which is also something very interesting that I've been noticing. A lot of the models have not really been showing much occurring in the eastern Pacific, and at least from what I've checked, maybe if you go long range, they are starting to hint at something trying to get going there too. But as of, at least for the short range, nothing going on there. And of course in the Atlantic as well, at least for the short range, or aka the next 7 days, which is of course what the NHC goes out to. So let's take a look at that, the next 7 days, this time with the European model. Usually I like to use the GFS, but decided why not, let's switch it up for today, and we'll use the European. And you can see here already off the bat, this is the remnants of Arlene, kind of gets entangled in this overall big non-tropical system that lifts out into the Atlantic and doesn't really become much of a concern for us anymore. And then this is skipping ahead to the next 5 days, nothing going on, and this is 150, 160, 8 hours out, and you can see nothing else really gets going at all. Nothing tight in vorticity, and either in the eastern Pacific as well. Let's go there, since we're talking about the eastern Pacific, and let's just go through the run. Let's just go through the model over the next 7 days. Nothing gets going. Maybe some sort of small pocket of vorticity here that is maybe associated with some sort of small surface trough but of course it doesn't consolidate into anything big at all. So that's not really concerned for development. And of course, over the next 168 hours, or 7 days, as you would say, nothing else occurs too in either the Atlantic or the Eastern Pacific as well. Nothing consolidating as of yet. But of course, as I did mention, there are some people talking about something that tries to get going towards mid-June in either the Atlantic or the Eastern Pacific, the general Western Atlantic, Central American region, as we usually like to call it, Central American gyre, some sort of situation like that. Some people are talking about maybe towards the middle to latter part of the month. We have to watch for that. But of course, it is June 4th, and it is some ways out for right now. But of course, over the next few weeks, nothing really going on in the world of tropics, of course, at least for us. The Western Pacific, I think there's something going on there right now. Could get another major typhoon, but of course the Western Pacific is usually more favorable than our part of the world. Earlier on, they can really get development any time of year, as opposed to us here in the Western Hemisphere. We only really see chances for development occur in a specific time period, and we're just getting into that time period where we start seeing things become more favorable, and we still have time to get to the ripe time period, I would say, where things will be most favorable for us. That is still months out. Until then, things will continue to be quiet, but of course we'll get development from here and there. So since we're not talking about much, I guess I should get off. I'm going to try to post tomorrow, and we'll see if anything does pop up. Of course, till then, stay safe. If you did enjoy what we saw, if you did enjoy what you saw today, definitely give it a like, definitely subscribe, and share with family and friends on my channel. Most important, especially to help growing the community. So that'll definitely do that. That'll be very helpful. Other than that, enjoy the rest of your evening, enjoy the rest of your weekend, and enjoy your week ahead. And I'll talk to you again soon.